All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Tech Days 2022. I'm Jamie Machik, the education consultant for the Wisconsin Valley Library Service, and Shauna Kosegi from the Southwest Wisconsin Library System is helping me behind the scenes today. Thank you, Shauna. I think Joy Schwartz is here too, so thank you, Joy. This year, Tech Days is supported by all 16 of Wisconsin's public library systems. In addition, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction Public Library Development Team provides support from the Institute of Museum and Library Services through LSTA funding. All the webinars will be recorded and will be captioned, and tomorrow you'll receive an email with the link to the recording. This afternoon's webinar, this is our second one in the Tech Days series, is presented by Laura Solomon, and she's going to be talking about making your images ready for the web. If you have questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A icon on your Zoom toolbar or the chat box, and we will make sure they get answered. So Laura, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, take it away.
Thanks, Jamie. Hi, everyone. I'm coming to you just south of Cleveland, Ohio today. And as Jamie mentioned, please feel free to ask your questions or make your comments in either the chat area or the Q&A box. I will try to keep an eye on both of those, and I'm usually pretty good at interrupting myself and putting myself back on track. So don't feel like you're interrupting me. I actually like these to be as interactive as they possibly can. So if you have your own experiences to share, please do that, because sometimes the best way to learn is not just from the person who's going to be rambling at you for a while, but from the other people who are here with you. So you can have a whole conversation outside of what I'm saying. It's perfectly okay. So I have a lot of information to share with you today, but before I get started, first I want to say you all are making some terrific things for dinner. Clearly I am slacking, so I want to compliment you on that. But also I'd like to just kind of ask everybody to put into the chat area, what is it that you do in your job that that's something that you have to do images. So why do you have to work with images? That's what I'm really trying to say there. I'm stumbling all over myself. So Candy says advertising. I saw Facebook page management, posters, Facebook web page, social media, website. Lots of things are scrolling by me. Social media, lots of those, all of those, communication to boards and stakeholders, art kits for children. That's a new one. Kind of scrolling back through some of these since they were coming at me. Flyers, promoting programs. I think we got a lot here. Okay, we've got quite a variety of stuff. Definitely some overlap, no big surprise. Often jobs will require people to work on more than one of these. Pictures on Facebook, flyers, web calendars, brochures, bookmarks, lots of stuff here. So I won't be, for those of you who only deal with print, this will still be helpful for you if you have to do anything with those images. This will be mostly geared towards the digital, but it will give you some background in terms of working with images that are going to end up in the digital realm. So let's get started, first of all, with just a broad kind of categorization of what I'm going to be covering today. So I am going to be doing the basics. And for some of you, this might be old hat, but in my own experience, most people don't know the difference between certain kinds of formats or why they should use one format over another. And that's what we're going to be covering in that basics or foundational area of stuff. Next, we're going to move into the best practices. So these are the rules, right? The meat and potatoes, the things that you should do or you shouldn't do with these things. And then lastly, for those of you who told me your work is in social media, this is going to be aimed specifically for you because so many of us do have to work with images in social media. And there's actually a good bit involved in that. As easy as it is to stick a photo up on Facebook or a graphic on Instagram, there's some things you need to know to really make that work for your library. So again, if you have any questions, any comments, throw those into the chat, throw them into the Q&A, and I will get to those as soon as I can. You do not have to wait until the end. All right, so let's talk about formats, because while sometimes people will just like be oh, I'll save this as a JPEG, or I'll save this as a GIF or a PNG. They actually have very specific uses for the most part, and you definitely want to create your image or save your image in a format that's going to work well for wherever that image is going to end up. So the first thing we have to do is take a kind of that high level view of the different types. And before we even start talking about, hey, GIF versus JPEG, et cetera, we have to talk about a broader categorization, and that's raster versus vector. If you've never heard these terms before, don't worry about it. For some of you, you might work purely in raster or purely in vector, but let's talk about what they are and why they matter. There are two types of digital graphic files, vector and raster. And all the things that I mentioned before, like PNGs, GIFs, et cetera, come under the, in this case, the raster umbrella. But vector images are made of hundreds of thousands of tiny lines and curves. They're called paths in the vernacular to create an image. Raster images are composed of pixels. And I bet everybody knows what a pixel is. But this picture right here is probably one of the easiest to absorb when it comes to the difference between a vector and a raster graphic. You can see here the vector is much clearer as compared to the raster, and there's a reason for that. Vector graphics have to be created in computer software that's designed to create it. It's an intricate wireframe type image, and each line includes defined node positions and locations and line lengths and curves. And any of the lines and curves in an image can be assigned a color value. And this, of course, is very different from creating a raster image, which is done in pixels. But with a vector, because it has this defined, more kind of formulaic approach to drawing, each image can be sized and scaled both up and down without losing any of the quality. Because rasters are made of individual pixels, they can start to lose resolution, especially when they're made bigger. I'm sure everyone here has probably experienced this. You've taken an image, you've made it bigger, and the edges start to look blurry or pixelated. You've probably heard that term before. And that's because those pixels are starting to show. They're not really scalable. So a vector image will always appear smooth, no matter how large you make it or how closely you zoom in. And text is actually vector images. People don't realize that. No matter how much you increase a font size, it's never going to change in terms of its quality. And so that, in fact, is a vector that you probably use every day. In fact, we're using in our chat interface right here. Those words or characters are vector images. Another advantage to using vector images is file size efficiency, because the files are only identified by mathematical descriptions. There's no pixels. It's basically all code under the hood. And so files are often much smaller than those of rasters, because vector images are therefore easier to transmit. They're smaller. They don't require as much information. Because you're not literally tracking every single pixel to create that image. So those files in raster images are typically much, much bigger. The biggest problem, though, with using vector images, because you might be at this point thinking, well, why don't we use them everywhere? They sound fantastic. The biggest problem is that images are often saved as native files. So what does that mean? It means that if you're working in, say, Adobe Illustrator, stuff is going to be saved natively to the Adobe Illustrator format. Not everybody has Adobe Illustrator, and so they aren't even able to open those files. And of course, the web does not display, for example, .ai files. So they have to be converted to something that's web compatible. So those programs that create vectors are generally not available to everyone, and many vector formats are not workable on the web. So there's the trade-off. Great quality, easy portability in terms of its size, but that's kind of where the benefits end. We are starting to see some vector formats start to make their way more commonly onto the web. SVG is one that you might see more commonly, but the support for it is still kind of spotty. And of course, you still need some kind of special software to create those SVG images. If your library has a logo, at least a professionally done logo, hopefully you have a vector version of it. Vector images are the #1 option when it comes to creating a logo because of the way images are created and the way that they're saved. Of course, there's more flexibility with making changes, and you can use it at a variety of sizes. If you've got that logo as a vector, then you can put it on a tiny little pencil or a tiny little bookmark. But if if you have a raster image, it's going to lose its quality the more you shrink it down. And same thing if you need to put it, say, on a big banner for the local parade or on a vehicle for your library, and you try to scale it up, you've probably got big problems if that's in raster format. It's not going to be pretty, very literally. So vectors are pretty much the go-to for most professional designers. You might think, well, we don't need a vector. Well, you might not need a vector now, but I guarantee you down the line, you are going to need it. Even if you think you just need a logo for, say, your website or social media, someday you're going to need that at some other size or some other resolution, and then you're going to be a very sad panda because you don't have a vector version. So just as an aside there, if your library doesn't have a vector version, then it's time to get one. And if you already have a raster version and not a vector version, I would contact a professional. Jamie's asking, do you have your library logo as a vector file? Do you know offhand? And Jamie, that's actually a really good question, because when I work with libraries and I do web development, obviously that's what I do. But many times when I'm talking to especially smaller, even medium-sized libraries, first of all, they often don't know what vector is. But even if they do, they'll be like, well, we have this file that the designer gave us 10 years ago, and they may not actually have a vector version, even if they know what a vector is. If you don't have one and you're not going to be changing your logo anytime soon, I'd recommend talking to a professional, because often they can take what you have and make it into a vector so you have a vector version. There is software that does it, but my experience with that so far has not been awesome. So I have nothing that I want to recommend at this point. And then, yep, so I've got somebody, Tricia says theirs is a vector file. Christy says, have no idea what ours is. And that's not uncommon, Christy, in my own experience. Autumn says ours is definitely a raster file. So yeah, Autumn, you might want to talk to someone about getting that made into a vector so you can have a lot more flexibility with it. So I mentioned before that rasters have pixels. Oh, Allie says we don't have one that has been professionally done, probably not a vector. Sadly, Allie, you're probably right. I've yet to run into a library logo that was professionally done, that wasn't a vector, and vice versa. I have not run into one that was created by the library that was done as a vector. And Carla, I'm sorry you're in the same spot. I guess that's part of the reason I do this, is so people understand the difference and why it matters. So rasters have pixels. They're actually often called bitmaps. You've probably heard that before, because the term bitmap's been around pretty much forever, because they're made of millions of tiny squares, like this picture here, which has essentially been blown up so you can literally see every single individual pixel. If you zoom in enough, you're going to be able to see all the square outlines of each pixel. If it's a raster, you might have to zoom in a lot, but you will see them, especially around the edges where there can be some major color changes. And as I mentioned before, raster graphics typically have larger file sizes than vectors do. So larger files can also be because there's a higher DPI, which is dots per inch. Those of you who work in the print world are very familiar with DPI. And then there's also PPI, pixels per inch, which can also be a setting that is used to create raster graphics. And so because the software has to keep track of all of that, and the higher the resolution is, the more carefully it's got to track those pixels, basically. You get these big file sizes. And you might wonder why that's such a big deal. Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit. I'm going to be talking about optimizing images. But the long and the short of it is, if you have a raster and it hasn't been optimized, it's going to download slowly. Now on social media, that doesn't matter. I can't talk today, folks. I'm sorry. It doesn't matter so much in social media because virtually all the platforms have some kind of algorithm that automatically compresses your image. Sometimes not so terrifically, but they all pretty much do it. Quality can be somewhat variable. But if you're doing something on, for example, a website, then this is really going to matter because if your website downloads slowly, you're losing people, guaranteed. I'd put money on it. The stats say it. Your bounce rate is going to go up. For those of you in marketing, you probably live in fear of a rising bounce rate. So optimizing images is really important. So you might wonder, what about photographs? Well, photographs, yes, are rasters. They're not created mathematically with special software. They're created with a camera, even if that camera is on your cell phone. So when photos are taken with a digital camera or copied on a scanner, those files are still raster images. And in print mediums, books, magazines, flyers, brochures, et cetera, raster images are often used to reproduce photographs. But the images are usually saved at a higher DPI, so the quality isn't going to suffer during the printing process. And this is an example, especially for print, where if it doesn't matter what the file size is, because it's going to print. So that's just something to consider. If you're only in the print world, you may not care so much about the file size. For folks who are only in social media, probably don't care quite so much about it, although most of the social media platforms don't accept vectors anyway. But if you're doing all of those, including web stuff, then this is going to become a concern for you. Now, there's kind of an oddball. And Susan says, most of our logos and images are vector software. Lucky for us, our administrative assistant is a graphic artist. You're very lucky, Susan. You have somebody who knows how to create vectors. Okay. Here we go. So I lost my train of thought for just a second. I was talking about hybrids here. So there's a couple file formats that are kind of raster, kind of not, kind of vector, kind of not. And there's some confusion about this. And that's EPS files and PDF files. Now, probably everybody here is familiar with PDF, portable document format. Pretty much everything online, it seems like, can be at least saved as a PDF. That's one. I'll talk about that in a second. The other that you typically will see more from graphic artists, for example, is the EPS or encapsulated PostScript. Those are self-contained files that are the same mathematically as vector files, but they can be created from raster images as well. And it's very compatible and portable because it's supported by pretty much all graphic software. The thing is, though, is that, like, for example, I mentioned I work on websites. So a library will send me an EPS file, but if it wasn't originally a vector, it's not going to magically make it a vector, even though it's a vector compatible format. It still has to be created, encapsulated PostScript alley. The actual extension, like you'll see something called picture.eps. That's the actual name, or sorry, abbreviation, and the file extension. So, and this is true with PDF too. If you don't create the thing originally as a vector, it's not going to be magically a vector just because you saved it off as EPS or PDF. So in the example that I was giving before about how libraries will send me files or logos with that .eps extension and say, I sent you a vector. Well, maybe. Maybe you did. I'm going to open it up and find out. A lot of times it's not. They just think it is, because something can be a vector if it's a vector when it started life and then gets saved to one of these formats. So although most browsers don't have any trouble displaying these three image types, because these are the three main ones the web will display. I think I mentioned these earlier, but there they are in case you didn't catch that. And thank you, Laura. She's typed it in for me. Although they don't necessarily have trouble displaying these are supported pretty much by everybody and everyone. Some are better suited for certain uses than others, and we're going to talk about those. So I mentioned before photos, they're always JPEGs. You could save one off as a GIF or a PNG, but that would be kind of a sad way to go with a photo. So we'll talk about that. So let's talk about each of these individually and why you would use them, because sometimes it can be a bit confusing. So I already mentioned JPEGs, photographs, always think of the two together. And part of that is because the compression that makes a JPEG is really great. It's good. It can smush things way down. And when you're talking about a photo, there's a lot of information in that photo because remember, it's still a vector and it has millions and millions of pixels. So if you're trying to send even a photo through email, this is the best way to go because there's some inherent compression there. Now, although most JPEGs look fine from a distance under normal compression, there can be a noticeable loss of quality, especially if users zoom in on it. So there is that downside. Now, if nobody's going to be zooming in on it, you may not care. But one of the things that JPEGs don't do that the other formats do is they don't support transparency. So what does that mean? If you've ever thought, well, it would be really nice if I could take this picture of a bear and make the background just transparent so I could take that picture of the bear and overlay it on something else, then you've basically been talking about transparency. JPEG doesn't support that, which means even if you take the background, say the woods, from out behind the bear, it's not going to support that. You're going to end up with some kind of hot mess because JPEGs can't do transparency. Even if you say, hey, this image has transparency, I made that background, those woods transparent, it can't do it. Now, one of the things also that JPEGs do really well, and one of the reasons that it gets used and really is the best choice for photographs, is that it has an unlimited color palette. So think about that. That's why photos and JPEGs go together. As many colors as there are digitally, 216 million or however many you've got, that's how many a JPEG can have. That is not true for example, GIFs, which we'll talk about next. So, but they do blend some pixels together to reduce the size of the image a little bit, which is where you get kind of the issue if things are zoomed in on. Again, it may not be an issue for you, but something to be aware of if you are using a JPEG. And by the way, not just photos. It doesn't have to be a photo. You can save any image as a JPEG. It's just most usually used for photos. So what about GIFs? Unlike JPEGs and PNGs, which I'll talk about next, GIFs force all the color of an image into just 256 colors, into a 256 color palette. Compare that to JPEGs where you're talking about over 200 million colors, and you begin to get an idea about why GIFs aren't used for photographs or many other things, because that reduces the image size. But those kinds of color limitations often lead to pretty noticeable coloring issues. Sometimes it's, you know what, Jamie, there's still a lot of controversy about this, which kind of stuns me because the creator of GIFs, and I'm sorry, I don't know his name, I'll lose on Image Jeopardy, I can't remember what it is, but he specifically has come out and said it's GIF, like the peanut butter. But people still say GIF. But so you can say it however you'd like. I'm just telling you what the creator says. So sometimes with that limited, thank you, Jamie. I bet you went and Googled it. Yay, Google. So with this limited color palette, there sometimes can be white spots or blotches, especially where images get more complex, because essentially what's happening is that the GIF algorithm is making some kind of quote unquote educated guess about what should be there, because if there are colors it doesn't have, it's like he kind of throws up its virtual hands and goes, I don't know, and puts something there that probably has nothing to do, or at least reduces the quality of your image. So any colors outside of that 256, and by the way, those 256 colors, that's what's considered to be a standard web palette. It used to be that images could pretty much only be created in those colors because there was no guarantee that any monitor was going to show anything beyond that. Thankfully, we have moved beyond that. But it's going to make those guesses. It's still, and for those of you who are old like me, you may remember there was a time when there were no PNGs and you only had a choice between JPEGs and GIF, and GIF was often the default. And this was why, because it only had the web standard, or sometimes called the web safe palette. So what happens if you have a transparent background, like for example, the one I mentioned before, a bear, and you take the woods out from behind the bear so it's transparent. You can take that picture of the bear then and put it over anything else or any other color, and that background won't be there. So GIFs do support transparency. So you might think, great, I will use a GIF. Well, GIFs are very good for simple graphics because, for example, clip art, animated GIFs that aren't photo or video clips, that kind of thing. This is one of the reasons actually that you've seen sort of the popularity of GIFs go downhill in recent years, is because we have so much now is from video. So GIFs clearly are not a good idea to use on video. But the way that GIFs handle transparency, because I mentioned they do have it, but the way that they do it is a little, I don't want to say sketchy, that's too strong a word, but you need to know how it does it. So GIFs take one of those 256 colors to be transparent. But this comes with some limitations, right? Because adding that transparency removes the color from what's already a very limited color palette. And so the other thing is that pixels in a GIF are either totally transparent or totally not. So they're either opaque or they're transparent. There's no in between. With a PNG, you get that kind of granular control where if you only have partial transparency, that you can get something that looks decent. Not the case with GIFs. So also with GIFs, round edges are going to have a white backing, and that's part of the issue I mentioned before when things go transparent or when it doesn't know what to do. You might have noticed if you've ever tried to remove the background from a GIF, it hasn't been probably an awesome experience for you, especially if there are rounded edges, because again, GIFs aren't great when it comes to that kind of granular control. So there's often little white bits left around the edges. I find it to be very frustrating. You don't get these nicely defined edges like you would for a PNG. But before I talk about PNGs, let's talk about animated GIFs, because this is actually pretty popular right now, whereas the plain old GIF is losing some of its popularity. Animated GIF's popularity is skyrocketing. Almost all the animated images that you find on the web these days are GIFs. Even if they are video clips, sometimes they will be saved off as GIFs, just because GIF is the only of the three that supports animation. So, but GIFs are popular. I don't want to tell you don't use GIFs. There's a reason that they're still around. They have a very efficient color size, file size, because of the number of colors. So you have a smaller amount of information, so you get a smaller file size, and they're easy to make. Even animated ones aren't hard to make. So it also has built-in features that allow for much more acute control over specific animation behaviors, like animation speed, whether frames stick around for a little while, how many times the animation repeats. All of this is available in the GIF format when you create an animated GIF in whatever software that is. You don't get that with either of the other two. Now, I've mentioned PNG. I've been kind of dancing around this now for a little bit. And PNGs are a lossless format. So what does that mean, lossless? So let me type that into the chat. Give me just a second so that you understand what I'm saying, because I always feel like that word is hard to absorb on a Zoom. There we go, lossless. So what do I mean by that? Well, JPEG is called a lossy format. So what it means, and you might remember with a JPEG, it gets smushed way down as part of the native algorithm. It's basically making it a lot smaller. It's possibly taking some of the information out. but not enough probably for any human eye to detect. With a lossless format like PNG, there's no smushing. That's the plainest English I can use. There's no compression that would affect the quality of the image. So unlike JPEGs, which creates sometimes artifacts, that's sometimes also in GIFs, those white spots around the edges, that's also sometimes called artifacts. A PNG file is always going to look at least as sharp as the original image. Unfortunately, and you may have guessed this already, what does that mean? It means it's a bigger file size. And you might think I'm harping on this, especially if you're a print person, but as a web person, file size matters a whole lot. We're going to talk about that. So PNG files tend to be a bit larger than JPEG files, especially when they're high resolution. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, there are some graphics or images that you're going to want to look really good. And the best quality that you can get out of a web format, that's raster anyway, is going to be a PNG for the most part. So this can make them difficult to share to the web sometimes, or between people even. Most platforms, though, do support PNG these days. I mentioned earlier that wasn't always the case. These days, thankfully, that seems to have gotten a lot better. PNG files also have the best capacity for transparency. I mentioned how with GIFs, even though they have transparency capability, it's making a decision. It's either transparent or it's opaque, and there's no in between. So JPEGs don't have any transparency. GIFs sort of have transparency, but it's kind of, I'll use the word sketchy. And then there's PNGs, which have a much better approach to transparency. So it doesn't remove a color from the available palette, and it has a full palette, by the way, just like JPEGs. So it doesn't remove a color like a GIF does, and it's much smoother. So you're going to get a better blending effect. There's, like I mentioned before, the partial transparency is going to do much better with a PNG. So think about the kind of image that you have and which of these would fit best for the purpose for which it's intended. If you have a very simple drawing, you probably want to go GIF, even if it's got transparency. Again, smaller file size. If you've got a very complicated piece of artwork that's not a photo, I suggest going PNG. If you have a photo, the default is usually JPEG, which allows you also to compress it a little bit. So this is your high quality piece right here. Don't use it willy-nilly because of that big file size. And if you're creating stuff for print, you're probably working with some kind of vector. But if you otherwise, you probably want PNG. Okay, moving on from the file type stuff. Any questions that I missed or didn't get to, please feel free to throw that in there, and I will still address it. But I want to talk about those things that come in that second section of the do's and don'ts. So let's talk about how you can do this stuff better, aside from choosing the right format, right? So I've been hinting, or maybe outright saying this, but let's talk about optimizing. Because I am someone who works specifically on web stuff, this is a big soapbox that I'm up on, and my hope is that by the day I retire, everybody does this for their web stuff because it's so darn important. So when graphic designers and photographers put out their final images, they're typically not optimized to reduce the file size. So for example, let's say you take photos with your cell phone of an event at the library. When you take that photo off of the cell phone or download it or whatever it is, and you have it up on your computer monitor, chances are it's really big, right? If you looked at it 100%, you can see, like, oh my gosh, this is too big. I can't put this on the web. I've got to make it smaller. Everybody gets that you have to make it physically or visually smaller, but that's not the only way that, or reason to optimize. Optimizing actually has nothing to do with the visual size. It has to do with the file size. Remember how we talked about these different raster formats in particular, how they have different file sizes? When they're bigger, especially, you're going to want to optimize. So what does that mean? Well, first, it means this. Having large images, just because something's big, for example, that image you took at your library's event that you downloaded from your cell phone, it doesn't mean that the file size has to be big. You can actually optimize the image, which will take out many, many pixels that the human eye can't even see, that you didn't even know were there. And so optimization does its magic, and you end up with essentially the same photo or image that you started with, but now the file size is a lot smaller. I'll show you an example of that in just a minute. So image compression can drastically reduce the file size of an image, even up to 90%. Now, sometimes the higher percentage you compress something, you can potentially lose quality. Fortunately, most optimizers have some kind of control built in where you can tell it how much and kind of see what the result is. And that doesn't reduce the quality to your naked eye, or anybody else's, which is what we typically are going for. So why would you bother to do this? File size, right? That's number one, which means things are going to load faster because that gives a better experience for your users. And just because you're on social media doesn't mean you shouldn't optimize. Yes, the social media folks will, well, not folks, but their platforms do some optimization, but the way they do it it's kind of like a hammer, a really big hammer on a tiny little nail. So everybody gets the same compression, whether you like it or not. So you may not like how your image looks once the social media algorithms have been done with it. So they're not likely to get as frustrated, and they're going to engage more, especially on a website. This is really, really important. Google told us long ago that if your site, especially your mobile site, takes longer than 3 seconds to load, you've already lost more than 50% of your audience. Web developers back in the day, we used to worry about 56K modems and everything had to be optimized, not just the pictures. These days, we're doing better than 56K modems, but I often joke and hold up my cell phone and say, these are the new 56K modems, because not everyone has amazing 5 or 6G. And I live out in the boonies, and I know this better than anybody. So we still have to be concerned about losing our users if things are downloading too slowly. Google likes you more. It actually improves your organic search rankings. Your website, for example, will do better in Google search ranking because Google loves faster sites. So the more time you can squeeze off your site load times, the better. This is one of the main reasons that big companies, I mean, I'm talking eBay, Amazon, they have engineers and developers, their job is to shave off time, download time, because they will lose customers. It's a big money thing. You lose customers because your site takes too long to load. They're gone, you lose money. You also get better conversion rates. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, it means patrons will like you more. Conversion rates may not matter as much to libraries. What a conversion rate is essentially someone comes to, say, your website and they see something there and you want them to, say, reserve a spot in a program or place a hold on an item. If they actually come to your website and then take that action, reserving the hold, reserving the spot in the program, that's a conversion. You got the person from point A to point B. But this goes right back to number one, faster loading. Although libraries don't do the same kinds of conversions as other kinds of entities, typically businesses, it still really matters. Also, for those of you who do email marketing, this is really important. And I bet those folks who say they're in marketing, this is something you're going to want to pay attention to, because if you're feeding large images into your email that you're sending out, it could push that email to the junk folder. It's considered spammy when you've got big images. So if you have something that's fairly big sized to the eye, you are absolutely going to want to optimize it so that Gmail and all the other email clients out there are more likely to let it through into somebody's inbox. Now, I said I would show you an example of file size compression. And here's an example from compressor.io. I'm going to give you a list of different optimizers you can use. All of them, by the way, are free. And if you are using some kind of software to create your images, For example, I use PaintShop Pro, but if you're using GIMP or Photoshop or something else, a lot of these more robust graphics programs have some kind of optimization built in. With GIMP, I think it's actually an add-on. But sometimes this is built right into your graphics program, whatever that is. So you may not need to go to a third party. But when I recommend graphic optimizers to people, I always give them something that's free. This is an example from compressor.io. And you can see here the Iguana on the left-hand side started out life as at, I guess, 700 kilobytes. And then after it was optimized, it was only 250 kilobytes, which is 64% file compression according to compressor.io. Thank you, Jamie. She just put the link into the chat if you want to grab that. And you'll notice that if you look at the Iguana, you can't tell the difference, right? If anything, the one on the right might actually be a tiny bit sharper than the part on the left. Remember why that is? It's because JPEGs have all kinds of pixels in there that the human eye can't see to begin with. So what optimization does is it takes those out a little sharper now because some of the fuzziness from those pixels is gone, and it compresses it by a whole lot. And the smaller you can get an image, the better. And this is a good size image. And look how far down it took the file size. This is not hard to do. Don't get scared by this. It's very easy. The way that pretty much all of these work is you upload your original. It does its magic. Sometimes you can tell it how much magic to do. And then you download the new version. That's it. Now, some allow batches at a time. Some are only individual. Here's just a few others that you can. I think Compress Now does batches. Kraken may also do batches. Compressor.io used to not do batches, or in other words, more than one image at a time, but I believe it does now. Some of these others may also do it now. So you may just want to experiment with these and see which one you like. You do not have to use any of these if you already have something available or that you've been using. Stick with it. Keep doing it. And Sveta, and I hope I said that right. I apologize if I just butchered your name. If emailing photos from your phone to use on social media, including YouTube, is it okay to email the photos as actual size, or is it better to choose a different size? Well, since you're emailing photos, it sounds like to yourself, is that right? If you're sending them to yourself, it's not such a big deal. They'll almost certainly go through. Okay, yes, to yourself. If you're just sending them to yourself, it's probably a non-issue. The problem comes when you're sending out multiple emails. So many clients have, algorithms are everywhere. They have certain rules for deciding if something is spam or not. And the biggest rule probably is, oh, you're sending this to a lot of people at one time, you're spam. That can be a problem. One of the other problems is, oh, you're sending this out to a lot of people and it's got a really big image in it. Yeah, it's probably spam. So those two things together will definitely alert any kind of filtering algorithms that email clients have. This is one of the main reasons you want to optimize things in your email. If you're sending it to yourself, you don't meet that rule because you're only sending it to one person, and the client can go, oh, if you're just sending it to yourself or to one person, no big deal. You're not trying to spam anybody, in other words. I hope that answered your question. So, I mean, you could choose a different size, or you could optimize it, absolutely, if you wanted to send yourself an optimized version, but you don't have to just to email it to yourself. It's a good question. How you name your files also matters, and this is something I am terrible at. I am confessing up right here. I know this, and I am very bad at naming files, but file names really do matter. You want to have specific keywords. Now, this is, again, mostly a website thing, clearly not going to matter in print, may not matter a whole lot for social media either, but if you're using something on your website or a blog or something like that, this is going to matter. You should have a clear idea of what your keywords are that describe that image and include them in the file name of your images, because the file name gives information that helps search engines, let's admit it, mostly Google, but yes, some other some other search engines, but it helps them understand what the image is about. So when you're naming your image files, let's go back to that photo of the bear. And let's say it still has the woods behind it. You could call it bearwithwoods.jpg, for example, and maybe put something between the words. And when it comes to putting something between the words in a file name, you should separate words. There are typically only two things you should be using. One is a hyphen, the other is an underscore. You should not be, you can always run the things together, although that's harder for search engines to parse. But the best way would be something, let me put this into chat. Hang on just a second. Let's say bear underscore with underscore woods dot JPEG. So this would be an appropriately named image. And this would be much more easily parsed by Google and its companions. So it can tell what it is, and that makes it better in search. So if somebody's looking for this, it's going to come up. Again, I'm not great at this, even though I know this. When I do name things, I actually do remember always. I use underscores all the time. My problem is that I don't always name them the best thing. So I could simply call it, for example, here, I would just say bear.jpg. And who knows, what does that mean really? And I see a question from Megan. Let me take a second to answer that. Would these sites be good recommendations to patrons who are trying to reduce the amount of space their pictures are taking up on their computer? Yes, actually, it would. The file size, I hadn't even thought about that for this session, but you're right. The file size does matter for storage. It doesn't matter if that storage is on a local computer or hard drive, or if it's up in the cloud on a server, or it's on your website on a web server, it doesn't matter. So yes, anytime you want to take the file size down, you can use these. And like I said, they're free. You don't have to be a librarian or anybody in particular to use them. So yes, you absolutely could recommend those to patrons. Good question. Okay, so name your files better than me. That's the lesson. Make them more intuitive so search engines know what it is that it's about. Now, another thing, when we come to do's and don'ts, has to do with alt tags. So if you wouldn't mind, take a second in the chat and tell me if you're familiar with alt tags. They're actually, the correct term is alt attribute. It's an HTML part, if you will. Okay, I see some no clues. I got a yes. Saw somebody, was it Lori, who said, yep, I preach about them all the time. Good for you. Okay, lots of no's, got a couple yeses. Okay. Okay, and Allie says, I know what it is, but not doing it yet. Okay, so I also teach web accessibility. It's a big, another giant soapbox of mine, and I spend a lot of time learning more about it. But so let me put something into the chat here so that you can take a look at this. So let's go back to my bear in the woods. Let's say I've named it right. Let's pretend Laura did something she was supposed to do. Bear underscore with underscore woods dot JPEG. Okay. So here's a plain old HTML image tag. IMG just tells the browser, hey, this is an image, could be any kind of image. This SRC is short for source, and in this case, we know the source is this file, bear with woods JPEG. However, if you are someone using assistive technology, for example, a screen reader, when you encounter this image on a page or a social media platform, by the way, because most of them do allow you to provide an alt attribute, which you'll see in a moment, then you have no idea what this is. What a screen reader will usually say is something like image, and then it will say bear underscore with underscore woods dot JPEG. What? Even people who are used to screen readers will be like, well, that's pretty useless. So they will know they have encountered an image, and they will know the name of the file, which clearly is not going to give them information. So how can we do this better so that someone using assistive technology understands the point of that image even being there? That's where we get into the alt attribute. So let's put this back in, bear with woods.jpg. But now we're going to add something new. Here with woods. Okay, so here's the better version, and you can see there's another attribute there in the image tag that says bear with woods in the background, and probably I'd include a little more than that, but I just want to get the idea across. The idea being is that you're providing information to people with disabilities so they know why that's there, or at least what the image is, so it's not just image in the file name. And like I told you before, I name things badly. So if anybody encounters my image with just a file name, they're really going to be scratching their head. So this is typically used as an accessibility piece, but this also is really good for search engines. So this can be a usability thing and an accessibility thing. One of the things I always tell people about accessibility improvements is that you will never hurt anybody by doing them. You will always help, and sometimes it won't be just people who are using assistive tech. This is one of those instances. So using the alt tag, or it's not really a tag, but that's what people call it, helps both. You should be using it anyway for accessibility, but it also helps search engines find it, just like naming the file properly. And Jane asked, do you say picture of bear with woods in background, or is picture assumed? When I use book cover, I'll alt texted book cover of. That's a good question. It's not, it's kind of redundant. So Jane, that's a really good question. So the general answer is that it's typically redundant because most screen readers have some version of picture bear in the woods with, you know, or bear of picture. It'll say, let me rephrase that. I told you I couldn't talk today. It will say something like image bear with woods in the background. Some say pictures, some might say something else. Sometimes they'll say it afterwards. It depends on the reader. They're all a little different, but the idea being the same, that it will tell the person who's interacting with it that it's an image or a picture. In the case of a book cover, I would say I would probably still include it because it's referring to a specific format. And also it gives a little more context, because it's saying this is the cover of the book that you're probably also talking about in the context of this post or this piece on your website or wherever. So it's making a reference to a format rather than a generic, hey, this is a picture of, or hey, this is an image of. So that's a really good question. And Lori says, what if the image itself has no value but links to a website, like a library's logo that links to the website? Good question. Then I would still describe it. It actually does have value. So from the perspective of someone who has an accessibility issue, like again, probably using some kind of assistive tech, when we talk about no value, there is not a whole lot actually that would come under that purview. So let's say you have a decorative bullet point, I should say, and it's just kind of cute, but it's still a bullet point. It doesn't really have value all by itself. Then you get something like this, and I'm typing into the chat, image src equals bullet point.gif, little accessibility lesson for today. And there you can see there's actually nothing in that alt attribute. It's empty. So it tells the browser, hey, this is decorative only. There's nothing in here and literally nothing to see. So there's no reason for it to be something the browser deals with. And therefore, if it's the browser doesn't need to deal with it, then the person on the other end of the assistive tech doesn't need to either. You're welcome, Jane. I'm glad that makes sense. So I don't want to go too deep into the weeds with accessibility, but alt tags matter for both because they help search engines find your stuff. And of course, they're great for people who have a disability. So when you're resizing things, I know I need to move faster here. I spend too much time talking about one of my favorite subjects. If you're using a program like, say, Adobe Photoshop, the quick and dirty way to do a reasonable digital enlargement is to do it in increments. And if you're using any kind of program, honestly, to make things bigger, do it in increments, usually about 10%. You might be really anxious to say, well, I need this to be 150% bigger than the original. That sounds really good until you realize, because of course you're working with a raster at this point, that things may not scale well. So you want to make sure that things are going to scale well. So do it in smaller increments, and that will save a lot of time for you. And it works both ways. Generally, more big stuff, making stuff big, I mean, than small stuff. But you can also do it when you're sizing stuff down, because sometimes things get so small, you lose the important details. Just as a hint for those of you who are doing this in some kind of software. The size of it does matter. Create images at the largest size they're going to be displayed. So what I'm showing you here, this is a real life carousel image or rotating banner image from a library that shall remain anonymous. And thankfully they took this down after a long time. The concept is probably fine, but you can see it's all kinds of stretched. And this is not something you want to be putting on your website. It's not a good look, right? Nothing screams unprofessional like a badly stretched out image. They were trying to make it fit the size of the carousel. I understand what they were trying to do, but unfortunately the result isn't good. If they create something really big and then resize it proportionately, probably smaller, I guess in this case, you're gonna get something better. You won't have these weird aspect ratios like this. Talk a little bit about quality too. So one of my other soapboxes, and I know I have a lot, especially when it comes to images, but I've been doing this for a long time and I'm old and cranky, folks. One of my big soapboxes is clip art. And clip art, I know it's easy to access. It's typically free, and it's easy. That's the bottom line, right? Clip art, it's out there. It's easy to get. But the thing is, if you're using this kind of low quality image, you're not going to wow anybody. Nobody's going to be impressed by this. So the thing I always tell people, and I have for years, is you do not want to be using the same kind of clip art my son was putting on his third grade book reports. It's not a good look for your community. If you're still using this stuff, stop, please. Find another way to do this. Get some stock art. There's free stock art, especially photographs out there, but almost anything is better than this. This is a reflection on the quality of the brand of a library. And when I say brand, for those of you in marketing, you know exactly what I'm talking about. For those of you not in marketing, when we talk about a brand, it's not just the logo. Everything that your library puts out there or even does on a day-to-day basis is part of the library's brand. Nobody wants to be branded as this clip art. There's a lot of high quality content out there that's also free. So I encourage you to investigate that. So a quick quality checklist for you is you want to make sure that your images are a high enough resolution so they don't appear pixelated. For those of you who are in print, you're very familiar with this idea because the stuff you send to the printer usually has to be probably 300 DPI or higher. Image DPI or PPI, pixels per inch, also can matter online. Can you read the text clearly? Sometimes, again, especially when people resize things, it can get messy, literally awful. So you want to make sure that you have nice, clear, sharp text. In the end, this is what you want. Does it look professionally done, or does it look like my son did it in the third grade? You don't want that. You don't want your library represented by that. Quality really does matter. I want to show you some real examples here. These are all real examples from real libraries. Tell me what you think in the chat. Here's one. What do you think? Blurry, says Angela. Yes, horrible, too pixelated, grainy, too pixelated, hard to read. The font, right on all these counts. Too many fonts. Yes, I actually just blogged about this. If you check my blog at meanlaura.com, my latest post is, does your library have a font problem? Too much text, not accessible. Right. There's all kinds of problems with this. This screen, and I'm sorry to be picking on my son. He actually does much better now. He's a senior in high school. But this looks like my son did it in the third grade. And clearly this was done by an adult. Oh, thank you, Jamie. She grabbed it. So this is not what you want out there for your library. This is not a good look. What about this one? And I'm sorry, that one ended up a little bit behind the others. But this was another one that caught my eye in a bad way. Angela says, too busy, too many fonts, bad font. Way too busy. Yeah, there's a lot going on here. No library brand. Aha, good point. That middle font was used in 1995. Oh my, super busy and weird font sizing. Yeah, so you get the idea. There's a lot going on here, and most of it isn't good, right? This is not the kind of stuff you want to put out there. Quality really does matter. Now, you might think that you have something that's okay. Oh, there was another one. There's some clip art. This all just makes me very, very sad. And yes, that's real. It came from a library's website. Here's another one. Give you a moment. Hard to read, says Angela. Underlining, says Jamie. Yes. What font is that? Ransom Note. That is a real font, folks, by the way. Hard to read with the logos. Too much to look at. Oh, Lord. You folks are going to make me lose it today. Jane says, oh, Lord. Yes. Bailey says, in the neon outline, capital letters. Labor intensive to read. Yeah. It's not good, right? We could probably go on. I think you get the idea. And sometimes, and Susan says actual information is too small. I think that for sometimes when people make this, they get very carried away with Canva. And Jamie says, Laura, isn't it implied that underlining is a hyperlink? Yes, it absolutely is. When we provide websites to libraries, we actually remove the underline feature in the editor where people can create content. We take it out on purpose, manually, because never, ever, ever should anything be underlined in the web if it's not a hyperlink, ever. Jane says, I laugh, but I understand the appeal of monkeying around with something because you can. Yeah, people go nuts with this stuff because I know, I get it. It's fun, but it's problematic, and marketing people here are probably hiding and cringing and probably want to drink at this point. And Jamie says, yes, Jamie's been reading my blog. Stop writing, click here. Yes, please. That's a different presentation, but that's something else. If you have something you think is okay, you might think, well, this is a very clean image. Sorta. It's definitely clean conceptually, because you've got pumpkins and they're there. And Angela says pixelated and floating in midair. The midair part's probably my fault, Angela, for plunking the original image on the slide. So I don't want to blame them for that. But you're right, it's pixelated, it's blurry, the resolution isn't great, the color balance is not awesome, although that's probably a function of the original image, to be honest. But one of the reasons that I put this here, you couldn't possibly have known. Besides the fact that it's not sharp, this actually came from a post about a pumpkin painting program. Kid you not. This was the image that was next to a description about the library's pumpkin painting program. So the first thing that came to my mind, aside from the quality, is where's the painted pumpkin? Why am I not seeing the finished product here? So when we talk about quality, yes, absolutely, we want things to be sharp and clean and not too busy and all of that. But you also want images that go with what it is they're meant to go with. In other words, don't plunk an image there just because you can and it sort of matches the content. If you don't have a good image, don't add it. I wanted to show you some good examples, by the way. Just as some more generic art, I think. And I think also these were actually created in Canva. I've seen some very bad things created in Canva, but I've also seen some very good things. These are just a couple. And it's actually, in my opinion, very hard to create something completely awful in Canva. Using Canva's templates is fantastic if you can. And they have either a free version for nonprofits or it's a much reduced. Maybe somebody here who's got a Canva subscription can tell us. But even with the free version, there's lots there to work with, and you get stuff that does not look like it was designed by my son in the 3rd grade. So a common problem some of you mentioned on some of those other images is that there's too much text. because people love visual content on social media because it's easy to digest, but too much text on your images has the opposite effect, because it needs to be quick, it needs to be concise. And some of you noted on at least one of those images we just looked at a couple slides back, there's too much text there, not just for accessibility purposes, there's just too much information. You shouldn't be trying to put your entire program description and every detail about it on an image, but that happens a lot. Here's just an example. This was actually a carousel, front page rotating banner kind of thing from a library. And not only is there too much text, it's text on top of text, which I did not understand. You're not catching this in mid-animation. That's literally what the slide looked like. So that was a problem. Here's another example of an image with too much going on. We could also talk about color contrast being an issue here. There's just too much information and the eye doesn't know where to go. Here's another example. This is where somebody literally took all of the description and put it into an image. And I thought if someone with a screen reader encountered this, they would be very, very sad and frustrated. Not only that, people without a disability not using assistive tech would be sad and frustrated because nobody's going to read this, not as an image. This is just awful. Trends also matter. Somebody, I think it was Jamie, joked about one of those fonts a few back being from 1995. This look is also probably circa 1995. Pay attention to trends. You know, there are gradients have kind of come back into vogue, but not like this. They're much more subtle with more color stops. This is a very old-fashioned, and I feel old just saying that. But this dates back to much earlier days in terms of trends on the web. You don't want to make your library's online content look like it came from the turn of the 21st century, which seems not all that long ago, but it does matter. So let's talk about social media. A lot of you told me that you work in social media and you want all of your pictures, your creative assets to look good when they hit somebody's feed, no matter what platform they're on. Social media algorithms tend to prioritize images that follow their best practices and use recommended formats. That's something not everybody understands. Algorithms control everything nowadays, whether we like it or not, mostly not. But if your image doesn't meet their criteria, that post that image is attached to is likely to get more buried than it probably already was going to be. One of the most important things that you can do is use something that's correctly formatted for the platform. Match the format to the platform. I'm about to talk about that in just a minute. Because if you don't, your images are going to look cropped, they're going to look like they have a lower quality, and that's not going to impress anybody, right? Remember I talked about Facebook, for example, takes a hammer in terms of compressing things. So you always want to make sure, too, that you have the correct dimensions for your content before you even start designing. So one thing that I will see sometimes libraries do is they create one image and then they take that exact same image, regardless of what size or shape it is, and they throw it up on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and so forth and so on. And that's generally not a good approach. So let's talk about what works for each platform. And Jamie says, I think that is where Canva really comes in handy with social media templates. Yes, it does do that really well. You can tell it, hey, I need a Facebook template for a birthday party, and it will come up with one or several. That's wonderful. Angela says the resizing function is great. Yes, although I think you have to have some kind of paid account, Angela, on Canva to resize it. Or maybe I'm confusing that with Crello. But I think Canva requires a paid or nonprofit account rather than a free individual one. Anyway, let's talk about Facebook. Historically, Facebook has pretty much prioritized and said, hey, give us horizontal images, give us landscape. That's all we want. We don't want anything else. And Jamie says the paid version of Canva is worth it. Yes, it absolutely is. And I don't get any kickbacks from Canva, by the way. I wish that I did. So Facebook, this is the originally thing was horizontal. Don't do anything else. Don't want anything else. But hey, Meta, used to be Facebook, Meta bought Instagram. So guess what Facebook takes now? Now they take Square ones as well. And part of that also is not just that they bought Instagram, it's that more than 80% of Facebook users only use the app or only access Facebook via mobile. So just going horizontal wasn't really conducive to making mobile users happy. And Lori says, problem I have with Canvas templates, specifically Facebook covers, is that they don't update the dimensions fast enough with Facebook's updates. I'm going to talk about getting those dimensions updated in just a minute, Lori, about that problem. Also, an image should look well on both mobile and computer. Yes, more considerations, right? And you all came into this thinking, how can Laura possibly go on for an hour and a half about web images? Yeah, we definitely can. There's a lot, more than we can talk about today. Now, when we talk about Facebook, if you're using Facebook's built-in business suite, which if you're working with Facebook specifically for your library, you almost certainly are, or at least should be, there's actually a built-in feature where you can scale stuff down or adjust the aspect ratio. It has these built-in tools. And you can upload your image, you can click the pencil icon and then select the aspect ratio. That's actually what you're seeing here. Actually, you're seeing crop here. Sorry about that. But you can also adjust the cropping. So you probably honestly already did this outside of Facebook, but I wanted you to know that in fact, there are some built-in features into tools. Here we go. What about stories? Because Facebook, Meta rips off everybody else. Sorry, that's my very biased comment. So now they have stories, just like Instagram has reels. And what do you do about these? Well, they have a specific aspect ratio, and that's 9:16. I should put that in the chat. So this is Facebook stories, 9:16. So that's what they want, because then it allows it to have a full screen display on mobile devices. Also, again, if you're uploading via Business Suite, you can use the built-in editing tools to adjust whatever it is to this aspect ratio. Now, there's no guarantee it's going to look great if it wasn't anywhere close to that aspect ratio when you created it, but it's interesting to know that there's tools in Business Suite that allow you to change that. It might be enough to save you. Then we get to Instagram. And like Facebook, Instagram's optimal ratio has evolved over time. Notice this looks very familiar. Guess what? Meta owns both. So this set of tools is very similar, if not the same. Initially, Instagram only allowed square images. And it wasn't all that long ago where it was like squares, that's it. But again, now we have this crossover between Instagram and Facebook. So as the platform has increased its focus on Reels, especially in the past year or so, the algorithm has also begun to prioritize portrait-sized or aspect ratio images. And in May of just this year, the head of Instagram, Adam Mosseri, announced that the platform has been testing 9:16 photo placements, just like Facebook. Well, big surprise there, right? So that could be another creative shift. So someone mentioned here just a minute ago, it was Lori, about things updating faster than Canva can keep track of it. This is one of the reasons why. Stuff is changing all the time. What about Pinterest? Slide there. What about Pinterest? So Pinterest has always prioritized vertical images. That's not going away. But the aspect ratio is a bit different from other platforms. So for standard pins, Pinterest recommends actually a very different aspect ratio. So Pinterest, let me put that in here, is 2:3. And generally, they want their images to measure about 1,000 by 1,500 pixels. And I'm going to give you a cheat sheet for these sizes, so don't panic if you're not catching all this. So to optimize images for Pinterest, you want to create a new pin, upload an image, and they also have some tools for kind of working with your images. There's a pencil icon when you upload, and you can select one of the available image presets. Again, no guarantee that's going to make your image look really good, but it does allow you to make some changes to it. Pinterest does support other aspect ratios. but it's recommended that you upload it 2 to 3. Just as you can try others, but it's kind of a crapshoot. Then we've got Twitter. What about Twitter? So Twitter really is a lot more ambivalent, I think, than some of the other platforms. So while most platforms have shifted towards a portrait or a full screen vertical, square and horizontal images, kind of like Facebook really, are optimal for Twitter. So those portrait ones, nah, not so much on Twitter. But if you've got something that's a rectangle or a square, that's probably going to work fine. Their recommended ratio is generally about 1 to 1 for squares. Although they say that for squares, they also recommend 1200 by 1200. So remember, you want to create images at the biggest size you can. If you know that in this case, maybe Twitter is going to be your biggest platform, literally. Create at 1200 by 1200, maybe smaller for others, depending on what they allow. With TikTok, it's funny, I was just talking about TikTok with Jamie. I told her I'm completely addicted to it. I spend way too much time on TikTok. I don't know if anyone else here has that problem, but my son, I mentioned he's a senior, during the pandemic got me hooked on TikTok, and now it's my life. I don't make content, I just consume it. Autumn says guilty as charged. We'll have a support group later, Autumn. Anyway, with TikTok, you're probably going to record or upload videos to TikTok directly in the app, but the app also supports animated images. A lot of folks don't know this, but it does. And TikTok also probably has the broadest range of different aspect ratios that it allows, which is almost kind of funny considering literally everything is full screen vertical when you're looking at it on a phone, which pretty much everybody does. So that's pretty much what it wants. It will take other things, but what it really wants is full screen vertical images, and trying to do anything aside from that is probably a poor bet. TikTok doesn't have a built-in cropping tool like Instagram, Facebook, but you can manually resize images by pinching to zoom or dragging to reposition. So it does have that. It does not have the extensive tools that some of these other platforms have. Now, I told you I'd give you a cheat sheet, and Jamie, if you can put this URL into the chat for people to grab, I'd appreciate it. So this is Hootsuite's blog, and every year they come out with a new version of this. So this is updated right now, but again, Lori mentioned earlier, stuff changes, and that's one of the reasons that this says image sizes for 2022, because these platforms are constantly evolving, and so these changes happen often, sometimes more than once a year. So if you find that what you're doing isn't looking right, you may actually even want to Google and say, hey, you know, what does Pinterest want? What does Facebook want? You know, 2022 or whatever, trying to get something that's the right size. As Lori mentioned before, the Canvas or Canva templates don't always keep up with the extent or the rate of change that some of these platforms have when they're making changes. One thing I can tell you is that there are usually small tweaks from year to year, which is why Hootsuite does this every year. In fact, there's other agencies that do something like this every year at a minimum, because there's always something a little different. I mentioned, you know, Instagram used to be squares only, and now it's squares and rectangles, and so forth and so on. So bookmark this for now, and you may need to come back and check later to see if those image sizes and aspect ratios have changed for whichever platform you're working with. So the big takeaways for today, I know I gave you a lot of information, is to know your formats and which to use and why and when. That's one of the most important things you can do. Make sure you use the right format for the right thing. Second, optimize your images for download speed. It will help them get seen. It will help the download time. Google prefers faster sites, and you'll end up often with cleaner looking images, not just a smaller file size. Thirdly, use recommended practices so you don't inadvertently turn people off. So you think about those images that I showed you that were from libraries that didn't look so good. Imagine what people's reactions are who are outside of the library when they see that stuff. They're going to think, oh, Laura's son, when he was in the 3rd grade, created that. That's not what you want people to think about your library. You want stuff that's going to look good and that's professional. And these days, honestly, with the amount of content that's out there, especially on social media, we can't afford to have things that look like my 3rd grade son created them. It's not going to be, not just, it will hurt your library's brand and your social media presence. So be very cautious about the quality of stuff that your library is putting out there. Lastly, social media platforms all have their own rules and recommended sizes, as you saw, and they change. That's the part that nobody likes. They change. So, and you can't create one image for all of them and still have a good quality image across the board. That, unfortunately, is the reality of working with social media. So those of you who work with social media, you may already have known that and groaned and maybe cried a little, in the bathroom about it. It's not fun, but it's something that we need to be aware of and we need to do. So I'm happy to take any questions that I didn't get to or any comments that you might have. Jamie, I don't know if I missed anything. But while people are thinking about that, I want to ask you all a question. Which thing that I talked about today made the most impact? And so that's the thing you're going to deal with or take care of when you get out of here today, or at least soon after. What suddenly became a top priority for you when you're talking about working with your images in your library? Cole says optimizing images. Christy says optimizing and alt tags. Angela says we need a new logo. We have one. It's just stuck in the 80s. Susan says no before you go. Yes, that's very true. Chris says, can you tell me, whoops, sorry, stuff was scrolling by. Chris says, can you tell me what the difference between a JPG and a JPEG is? My understanding, honestly, Chris, is that it's the same format. There may be some very slight differences. I'm not sure why they're different. I think JPEG might simply have been an older acronym or extension. A good question. I'm not sure I have a definitive answer. I know that JPEG has fallen out of favor somewhat. Anne says naming photos and optimizing photos and logos. Yes, do better at naming than me, Anne. Barbara says optimizing images. That's a big one. Lori says Hootsuite image size guide is awesome. Yes. Laura says reduce clip art usage. Laura, don't use any. But yeah, get rid of it entirely, I would tell you. That's my very biased opinion. Carla says save in the correct format and size right. Yes. Autumn says watching my wording / text on flyers and media and new logo needed. I've convinced people they need new logos, which actually was not my intent, but I can see how people kind of maybe came to that conclusion. Megan says reducing text on images. Jamie says, oh, she's got an article there. Yeah, that's Jamie, thank you. I thought they were pretty much the same thing from an algorithmic standpoint in terms of how they're compressed or saved. So I'm glad somebody's confirming that for me. Mick says there used to be a 3-letter EXT limitation, so JPEG now used as well. Ah, okay, so there's a technical reason. Laura Lee says use less clip art. Barbara says, I found the same article. People started Googling. Oh, I'll find it. We're all library people, right? It's like, I got to find that information as soon as the question comes up.
So, Laura,
I appreciate that. Thank you.
For people who are thinking of getting a new logo, should they, like if they're getting a graphic designer to do that, should they ask for different sizes of it, like a horizontal version that they can use on websites, or so they can avoid the sizing issues? Or does a graphic
Yes.
generally do that when they give
So when you're working with a professional designer, they should provide you with versions of the logo for both horizontal and vertical layouts. Just as a side note, I have a friend, she's now retired, but she worked in graphic design and had her own agency for a long time. And one of the things she told me is that if you're getting logo work done, make sure you're actually working with a professional who does logos. Look at their portfolio. She individually did not do logos. And she told people that. She said, that is a niche specialty. I don't do them. You need to find somebody else. She did all kinds of greeting cards and things. She wouldn't do logos because there's a lot of brand identity tied up in logos. So I always tell people what my friend told me. Make sure that when you go to get a new logo, first of all, get a professional. Never do it in-house. Just don't, because the results are not good. Don't run a contest. I can tell you horror stories about that. But work with a professional who can give you different kinds of layouts and different color palettes to work with potentially, and you're going to get something far better that's going to last you a lot longer. So there's my soapbox for the day.
And we still do have a few minutes left. So if you do have a question for Laura, feel free to type it in the chat area or the Q&A. I guess while we're waiting, Laura, did you want to share any, I guess, just web trends for 2023 that you know of? Are they much different than what we've seen in the last 2 to 3 years?
I don't think so, especially when it comes to library stuff. I mean, there's always trends with design specifically, but often when we're talking about design, it's a lot like fashion. So there's high fashion, the stuff that shows up at New York Fashion Week and nobody can afford, but looks amazing. And then there's knockoffs that hit the mainstream stores that eventually some of us can afford. And so I think web design is much like that in the sense that a lot of when we start talking about trends, we first see it on very high profile, especially portfolio type sites, people who have honestly more artistic license than some of the rest of us do. And then things tend to trickle down to the rest of us. Like for example, more complex gradients being one of those. In the last couple of years, they've started to trickle down to more mainstream use. And I saw a couple questions there. Carl asked, I'll admit most of this was over my head. Any sites or books that I can start with? I don't have anything in particular, Carla. My information is collated from my own experience and just some specific tech posts. So I think when we talk about something being over your head, probably I would start researching those things that are over your head specifically. I don't have any one central source, unfortunately, that I can refer you to. Angela says, random question. Lately, I've noticed that when I download event covers for Facebook from Canva, they just don't look good when uploaded to Facebook. Any tips? I think this actually goes back to what Lori was saying about how Canva's templates don't update fast enough. I would check the size of Canva's templates against the latest recommendations for the sizing and the aspect ratio, because they do change. And I have noticed that, not recently, because I haven't had to do that recently, but my own experiences with Facebook covers is that things I created did not look right. So keep up with those numbers, I think, is really the only solution I can give you. Great. Oh, good. Jamie says WVLS can help you, Carla. Good. Thank you, Jamie.
So we are just about out of time. I do want to mention, I guess, just a small plug for Laura. If you enjoyed her presentation today, Laura did a presentation on social media trends for 2023 for our library system cohort. It's not a live webinar, it's a recorded one. I have to load it, but when I do, it will be available statewide, and I will post it on WisPubLib. So be on the lookout for that. It's on social media trends for 2023. I have yet to watch it, Laura, too. I have to do that. That's on my to-do list.
That's okay.
So thank you, Laura, for the presentation. Thank you, everybody, for your participation, your questions, your comments. It was just fun to feel the energy out there, and just makes the presentation that much more enjoyable and fun for all of us. A link to the recording for today's webinar, along with the slides, will be emailed to you tomorrow, and we hope to see you tomorrow morning at Richard Burns' webinar called Canva. Speaking of Canva, Canva for teachers and librarians, and that will be at 10 a.m. tomorrow. If you haven't registered, you still can. So we hope you all have a great rest of your day. So long.